This is the Justicefighter Podcast. Justicefighter Podcast. With attorney Gerald Griggs. Attorney G. Where we have conversations on social justice, civil rights, and political news that affects us all. Let attorney Griggs put you on game. Only on the Justicefighter Podcast, y'all.
What's going on, y'all? It's attorney Gerald Griggs, the Justicefighter, here for the Justicefighter Podcast. And like I said in the previous episode, we're back. It's 2024. There's a lot going on in justice, in civil rights, and social justice. And so I wanted to come back on the podcast and make sure I kept you guys updated on what's happening in real time. And so for those that have not and is listening for the first time, please subscribe to the Justicefighter Podcast and share it with your friends. We will be bringing information on social justice and civil rights that kind of is not as covered in the local news or the national news and, of course, in Georgia news. And so that's the purpose of this podcast, to make sure we are abreast of what's happening. And so I wanted to hop on here and talk about the Fulton County Reparations Taskforce. I was honored to be invited to come and witness the task force by the Vice Chair, Marcus Coleman. And I must say that I was impressed by the presentation of these young genealogists that were there. But on the 19th, they had their meeting where the genealogists were able to trace and track down the number of slaves and slaveholders that were in Fulton County. And of course, in 1850, Fulton County did not exist in proper form. It was a combination of Milton, DeKalb, and Campbell County. And then, of course, 1860, they were able to determine the number. But it was very impactful, what we heard and what we witnessed and what we got to hear from. We heard from the task force chair, Dr. Sims Alvarado, in depth about the type of documentation that it will ultimately take to convince the county how it profited from slavery. And I think that's the big issue. You know, there are a lot of opinions on both sides of the aisle and both sides of the coin about reparations and you know, what should happen with this topic. And of course, I went on record both in front of the task force, but continued to reaffirm the position of the NAACP with regard to the issue of African slavery in this state and, of course, in the country. And I do want people to understand that this is a topic that needs to be discussed and needs to be addressed because, you know, you cannot have true justice and equity without repair. And so I want to play for you my statement before the Reparations Task Force. Here's my statement.
Attorney Gerald Griggs. I am the 13th president of the Georgia State Conference of the NAACP. I am also president of the Atlanta NAACP. And I rise today to, one, reaffirm the position of the NAACP on reparations. In 1991, we passed our first resolution strongly urging the United States and all of the governmental entities to affirm reparations for African Americans, particularly African Americans that have been enslaved in this country. And so I rise today to reaffirm not only in 1991, but 1997, 1999, 2001, 2003, 2007, 2016, 2019, and again in 2020. The NAACP, also known as the Association, reaffirms and continues to stand in favor of financial reparations for African Americans and those of African descendants in the United States who are the descendants of slavery and Jim Crow. So I rise not only as a president, but as a native Atlantan, sixth-generation Georgian, born out of this red clay, the great-great-great-grandson of a slave, asking and urging you to continue your needed work, urging and continuing to advocate on behalf of my descendants, those that have gone before me, but also for those that will come after me. It's time for this county to make amends for what happened in this county and to send a message to the rest of Georgia that it's time for Georgia to make amends for what happened to my ancestors and all of yours. So I'm hopeful that you will move forward, continue that great work, and come up with a great resolution to this issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
And so I thought it was important to lend my voice, but also to take a step back in history and really fully appreciate what's happening in Fulton County. What's happening in Fulton County is there's a task force that's charged with studying the issue and coming up with recommendations, and they've been meeting almost for a year to study out the issue and to make sure there's an informed conversation with regard to the issue of African chattel slavery in Fulton County. But we also have to remember there are 159 counties in Georgia. So there should be 158 other counties having this same conversation. And so 11 Alive was there, my friend John Sherrick, and he wrote an article and did the video. And it goes a little something like this. Atlanta, the Fulton County Task Force Reparations received results on Thursday of the groundbreaking research that is beginning to track every penny from all money that the county government took in from slavery and for decades of injustice. The documentation will be part of the report for the Fulton County Reparations Task Force, recommending where Fulton County Commission should pay reparations in some form now. At the task force meeting Thursday night at the Fulton County Government Center, 3 genealogist researchers reported that so far they have identified through census and county records every single slave owner and every single enslaved person in Fulton County beginning in 1850 when the county was created. Researcher Christopher Smothers describes the finding as heartbreaking. I was able to see a direct revenue and profits that they, the slave owners in Fulton County, made every single year, Smothers said, and how much they were paying in taxes every single year on each enslaved person. So they put the slides up and they showed, and they showed the number of slaves, the number of slave owners, the economic impact of the slaves. They gave names to the slaves. They also were able to show something that I don't think a lot of people knew. They kept census records on all the slaves. They were called the slave schedules. So you can actually derive the number of slaves. And then they talked about a genealogy. If you can trace yourself back to the 1870s, they can directly connect you to your enslaved ancestors or your enslaving ancestors. And so when we have this conversation about reparations, many people start talking about, I'm not going to pay for what I didn't do. I'm not going to pay for what I didn't benefit from. But, from the research, you can tell who benefited directly and who was actually affected. So I think as we continue down this conversation about African chattel slavery in Fulton County and in Georgia, we can trace it all the way back. And so it was just very impactful to sit in that room and listen to these young genealogists, 24 years old, who are going through the probate records, who are going through the census records, who are going through the slave schedules and mapping this information out. So when we start having these conversations, and I know a lot of people on social media have the conversations in the comments, step away from the comments for a moment. Actually look at the research, look at the numbers. Remember that in Fulton County in 1850, there was a slave who was 103 years old. I'm going to put that in perspective. There was a slave in Fulton County who was 103 years old and was able to not only see the birth of this nation, but to see the continued enslavement of individuals as the nation was born. If you were 103 years old in 1850, that means you would have seen 1750 and you would have seen 1776 as an adult. And so when you start putting that in perspective, when you start looking at the ages of the slaves, they had slaves that were 38. They had slaves that were 15. They had slaves that were 4. It starts to give back the humanity to these individuals whose freedom was taken, who were considered property. And let's be clear, 1850 was not that long ago. We always talk about this thing in a vacuum like it was so long ago. But 1850 to 1950 was 100 years. 1850 to 2024, you add another 60 years. That's 160 years. That's 2 generations. The average American lives to about 75, 78, somewhere around there, which you add that up, that's about 145 to 150 years. If you add those 2 lifespans together, that's 2 generations. So when we start talking about, slavery was such a long, 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 long time ago, I'm going to put it in perspective. My great-grandmother was Big Mama. She was born in 1898. I'm going to say that again. My great-grandmother was born in 1898. Her mother was born a slave. I'm going to say that again. My great-grandmother, so that's 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago, was a slave in Georgia. Now, my great-great-great-great-grandfather was a slave in Georgia. And so when you start talking about people's lineage and you start talking about people's genealogy, it hits at the core of who they really are. And so in Fulton County, we need to continue to study this out, and then we need to come to a recommendation that is fair. People need to be repaired, made whole. And, genealogists were talking about also, they were talking about the companies that benefited from the industry of the time. The industry of the time would have been agriculture and industrial. And you can draw those lines directly to the profit margins. And so it's going to be interesting to watch this happen in real time. The task force meets every 3rd Thursday, sometimes virtually, sometimes in person. We need more people down there. We need more individuals focused on what's happening in real time in our government about things that happen in our state. And for the naysayers, I would just strongly urge you to listen to the empirical data, listen to the researchers, listen to the scientists that are doing this work, and then make your decision. But know this, that at some point in this country, there's going to have to be a serious reckoning about what happened in this country. Our Japanese brothers and sisters got reparations for the internment of Japanese Americans in this country. Our indigenous brothers and sisters still require repair, but they also were given reparations. Even the slave owners in this country were given reparations. Again, I'm going to say it again, the slave owners in this country. And that leads me to my next point in the Justicefighter Podcast. There is the Republican primary that's happening. Iowa has happened. And again, as the president of the NAACP, I'm nonpartisan. I don't have a dog in this fight. I just want people to vote. I'm just reporting the facts. Former President Donald Trump won the Iowa primary by a landslide over Nikki Haley and Governor Ron DeSantis. And now they've shifted to New Hampshire. But there's been a kind of an uproar about some things that Nikki Haley has said on the process of trying to secure the Republican nomination for president of the United States, saying that America was not a racist country. And I try to give people the benefit of the doubt when they say things like this. But let's just be clear. The founding document of this country, the Constitution of the United States, said that black people were 3/4 of a person. So regardless of where you think the country is right now, the country was formed on racist beliefs and ideologies. It also had no rights for women. It had no rights for minorities. And so when our politicians are going around the country making up fairy tales about the history of this country, we have to be more intentional on calling them out and correcting them. Ms. Haley, who is of South Asian descent, needs to understand that it's not a great idea to not embrace the full being of American citizens. Yes, we all are American citizens, but we also have heritage other places, and we need to embrace that. It's not a good idea to try to sugarcoat or flowery word things. America had a racist past. America still has vestiges of racism. America has systemic racism that needs to be addressed. And you only need to look as far as the conversation on diversity, equity, and inclusion to realize racism is very much still alive in this country. And we as a people, American people, need to call it out, need to address it in real time. And so as we matriculate through the primary season, both on the Democratic and the Republican side, we will continue to call out issues that are very clear. Nikki Haley, racism is real. Racism is in this country, and racism has to be addressed. She also made some other statements with regard to slavery and things. It would just be helpful if her camp would address these things wholeheartedly and full-throatedly about, the things that are important in America, like moving forward in a diverse method and recognizing our history, apologizing for our history, repairing our history, and moving forward as one nation, indivisible, that is focused on justice and equality, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everybody, and not just a base that likes red meat. So that's all I'm going to say about Nikki Haley. We have a lot of things that are happening in Georgia. Redistricting, the redistricting maps have been approved. And so there will be several new minority districts, particularly focused on African Americans. So we need to make sure we register folks to vote, make sure we get them educated on what the candidates stand for and the issues. And we need to talk about, issues that affect Georgians in 2024. Issues like more funding for education, more funding for health care, making sure our right to vote is protected, ending police brutality, and then making sure that there is a issue-based conversation on climate change, an issue-based conversation on wealth inequity, an issue-based conversation on housing affordability, an issue-based conversation on inflation, issue-based conversation on the issues that affect us right now. We can talk about slavery. We can talk about racism. But let's talk about it in its context, and let's give it the contextual analysis that is necessary. We need to talk about the banning of history. Because, yes, American history is uncomfortable. It's ugly. It's not flowery. There are things that happen in this country to minorities and women and LGBTQ folk that are ugly. They need to be named. But we also need to have our politicians have a fact-based analysis and conversation on the things that are going to move us forward as a people to make the next generation diverse, equitable, inclusive, and focused on making this country great for the first time. So, we just gotta call these politicians out, man, because it gets really interesting. And that leads me to the announcement that happened here in the city of Atlanta this week. The family of Deacon Johnny Hollman, and for those that don't know, Deacon Hollman was killed in August by an Atlanta police officer by the name of Kyron Kimbrough after a minor car accident where Deacon Hollman allegedly refused to sign the ticket. Of course, we saw the video. Deacon Hollman ultimately said he would sign the ticket, was just exercising his First Amendment rights to make sure that his rights weren't going to be violated. And then, of course, he was tased to death by the Atlanta police. So the lawyers and the family of Deacon Hollman announced that there was a lawsuit filed against the city of Atlanta, the police chief, Darren Schirnbaum, and the officer. And so we were present for that announcement. The family is seeking redress for the civil rights violation. But the lawsuit, in the 6 counts, count 5 articulates in detail the amount of police brutality that has occurred in the city of Atlanta from 2006 to 2024. And it's something that I think everybody should listen to and should read and, get a copy of the complaint to see how in most of those cases, there was no punishment meted out for the city of Atlanta for the police brutality that has been occurring. And so, as an activist, we've been saying this forever. There's a police brutality climate in Atlanta that's been covered up, that's been not exposed. And I thank the family of Deacon Hollman for bringing voice to this. We have to keep that family lifted up. But we also have to remember the loads of other families that have been subjected to police brutality. Oscar Kane Rogers, Deatrick Griffin, DeAndre Phillips, Jimmy Atchison, Rayshard Brooks, Nigel Cullins. These are just a few of the ones that were killed. But this lawsuit details the ones that were not, that were injured and hurt and had all types of physical and mental distress placed on them. And all of those cases were, in most circumstances, justified. And so there's a climate in Atlanta that needs to be addressed. We're not the city too busy to hate if we are still allowing the horrors of police brutality to continue to happen in our city. We celebrated Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday and the federal holiday. I was lucky enough to be able to go down to Milledgeville and talk with the citizens there in Milledgeville about what the King holiday means so many years later. Dr. King would have been 95 years old on Monday. And, what he would have thought about where we are right now. And I think that Dr. King, one, would be happy that things have moved forward, but two, would understand that we still have such a long way to go on these issues. And, the biggest issue that he talked about a lot was, ending oppression and racial intolerance. But he also talked about police brutality. And he talked about true justice will never occur until the Negro no longer suffers the intolerable horrors of police brutality. That was from the March on Washington speech. But the thing that disturbs me the most about what's happening in the city of Atlanta is that 100%, and my sister Tiffany Williams Roberts said this at the press conference, and she said this many times. She's the policy lead for the the Southern Center for Human Rights. She said 100% of the victims of police brutality that are killed in Atlanta are black. 100%. Now let's be clear. Black people are not 100% of the population in the city of Atlanta. We are still the largest majority of the population, but we are not 100%. So there needs to be a real conversation and atonement and addressing of this issue by the citizens to our elected officials in the city of Atlanta, because it continues to happen. There continues to be individuals that are killed by law enforcement, and there seems to be a slow drum of justice. And so it was an impactful week. We have a lot going on in the city. We have a lot going on in our state. We have to be ready for the 2024 presidential primary, which is coming in March. We have a primary in May. And then, of course, we have the general election. But we also have these issues that continue to happen in the city, in the state, that are on the cusp of social justice. And I wanted to bring those to your attention in real time so we can make sure we are abreast of what is happening in real time. Last thing I want to leave y'all with, this is a little tip. Sometimes there are things that happen in Georgia, in Atlanta, that we don't really get the full picture of. I strongly urge everybody not only to read local press, but to go on the internet and Google what's going on in Georgia so you can know. Google what's going on in Atlanta so you can know in real time. Many people didn't know about the Reparations Taskforce that was meeting. Many people still don't know that, that level 1 trauma center that closed a year ago, Atlanta Medical Center, still has not been replaced. Many people don't know that legislative session has started. Bills are starting to be introduced, and I will bring you the bills as they are introduced. and we can talk about the bills and make sure y'all are aware of what's happening. But these things aren't reported every day. They're not reported every day. But if you go on Google, you can see what's happening. You know, I shout out to local media that does the best they can to get all the information out. But crime is down in Atlanta. Crime is down in Georgia. Violent crime is down 21%. So we don't need to see every single night on the news shootings and murders, because the shootings and the murders are down. But we have to stay abreast of what's happening in real time in our communities. We need to know about the attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We need to know about the attacks on our voting rights. We need to know about the attacks on the accurate teaching of history with the book bans and the attempts to ban diversity. You know, I had a great conversation, and I'm going to wrap up. I had a great conversation with a president of a local institution of higher learning. And they were talking about how the board of regents may be trying to quietly do what Florida and other places are doing out loud, and that's ban diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, of course, association, when it first happened after the decision for the Supreme Court, requested meetings, and we are in the process of meeting with different presidents of universities. But you need to be aware that it's happening in Georgia, and that it's not happening out loud, but it's happening in quiet silos. But we have to be focused in this 2024 year that justice will not take one step back. We will stay educated in real time about what's happening, and we will be on the front line. So I'm excited to continue to bring you all of this information on the Justicefighter Podcast. Again, I'm attorney Gerald Griggs, the Justice Fighter. Y'all stay up to date on what's happening, and I'm going to stay up to date on fighting for justice. I'm attorney Gerald Griggs. I'll see you on the next pod.
This is the Justicefighter Podcast. Justicefighter Podcast. With attorney Gerald Griggs. Attorney G. Where we have conversations on social justice, civil rights, and political news that affects us all. Let attorney Griggs put you on game. Only on the Justicefighter Podcast, y'all.